Caitlin, if you'll go ahead and record. Perfect. So good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Daniela Labate-Cavelli. I'm from NIAPRS and we're a MCTAC partner. I am joined today by my colleague also from NIAPRS, Eve Addis, our other colleagues, Marlo Passion, who is from the Coalition for Behavioral Health, John Capola, who is from ASAP, and we also have a guest with us today, Kirsten Vincent, who is the Executive Director at Recovery Options Made Easy. So we're so happy to see all of you here today. And this is like I said, the third webinar in our series, The Power of Policy and Procedures. And today's presentation is titled Policy Development Through Recovery Lens. So Caitlin, next slide, please. So just real quick housekeeping stuff. Today's webinar is being recorded. You'll be able to find the recording as well as the slides on the MCTAC or the ctacnewyork.org website within a few days. We encourage you to use the chat box. We're going to do, today's presentation will be a little bit different than the last couple that we've done. So we've got some presentation for you today, and then after that we'll have sort of like a Q&A with Kirsten, and she's going to give us some information about how they do things over in Western New York at her organization. And then, of course, we will have some time for question and answers. And so we're hoping that you'll use the chat box. You all have been very chatty with us, and we appreciate that and very engaged, and we like that. So we hope you'll continue to do that today with us and use the chat box. And please type in your questions to all panelists so that we can keep track of your questions throughout. Like I said, we've set aside at the end for question and answers. And there's also a lot of us on camera, so Caitlin's going to put some information later on in the chat box about how you can just sort of focus your cameras on the two presenters that are going to be taking place at a time. Next, please. This is just our partner slide, so you can see we have representation for MCTAC today. And like I said, this is the third webinar in our series. You can go ahead to the next slide. Thanks, Caitlin. And we've got one more coming up, and that's called Keeping Policies and Procedures Relevant and Responsive. And that'll take place in 2 weeks on the 8th, on April 8th at 1 p.m. And you can go ahead and register for that at ctacny.org. Okay, so I think we will get started now with a poll question. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Marlo, who's going to take over. And actually, Caitlin, you're going to help out because you're going to help us with that poll, right?
Yes.
Thanks, Daniela. So hi, everyone. We wanted to start things off with a question for all of you. In thinking about your organization's current policies and procedures, as well as your vision and values around whole health recovery, we'd like to invite you to weigh in anonymously through our poll. So the question is, how would you rate the alignment between your organization's policies and recovery lens? So again, some of the selections include perfect, great, good, fair, or help. Getting some goods, some fairs. Great, yes. Thank you so much for your openness to answering this question and really owning your responses. So thank you folks. A lot of goods, greats, and fairs. Thank you all. So just a few things for us to keep in mind as we go along in this presentation. Perhaps moving forward after today, we'll work towards great or perfect. We shall see. It's always a striving. But I guess we can move on to the next slide. So why a recovery lens? Well, if you, your team, and your organization stand for recovery, for values around trauma-responsive, person-centered, and resiliency-oriented practice, then it definitely makes sense to weave this culture and philosophy into the very fabric of what you do and how you operate and lead the organization. And this alignment between policies and procedures and the recovery culture make our work all the more meaningful, all the more authentic, and all the more impactful, as well as consistent. Let's go to the next slide. a little more on the why. So the recovery-oriented approach, or several of its approaches, have been shown to honor people's ownership and control over their own lives. It serves to encourage people to explore their own potential for growth and for healing. And it definitely works to elevate people from the stigma, oppression, and institutionalization that has kept most people marginalized at the fringes of society. So I think any one of us would want to have some measure of control in general, and to have policies and procedures that preserve our dignity and shared humanity. So if we imagine ourselves operating under policies and procedures that tell us we're not in control, we don't have a choice or a voice in various things that affect who we are and what we do, I think that would make for a very interesting work environment that I would say is perhaps unsustainable, which would then affect the overall organizational health. So let's take a closer look at the recovery lens in the next slide. So if we believe that all people can recover from a behavioral health issue and live a meaningful life, it definitely makes sense for us to thread the idea of recovery throughout our policies and procedures. Now, a reflection question for all of us to consider, perhaps something for us to address as a team, is where in my organization's policies and procedures do I recognize a recovery-oriented lens, just in reviewing the policies and procedures manual? And to what extent do I see my organization recognizing the value for people's dignity? Where do I see my organization recognizing people's potential? And how do I see, or how does my organization see people's strengths and needs? Just a few questions for us. On the next slide, there's a comparison between a more traditional lens and a more recovery-oriented lens, and a few terms do come to mind. So through a recovery lens, active participation in a process that encourages ownership, contribution, and accountability is often valued over rigid compliance that may, in fact, lack buy-in. So I guess one question for us is, do we dare include our team members in decision-making around new policies or revision of old ones? And do we ask for their input on how to craft procedures? Again, through a recovery lens, a collaborative approach that builds connection and buy-in is often used instead of a top-down kind of ivory tower method. Also, through a recovery lens, the policies and procedures are meant not to be frozen in time. They do get updated to match the times, to support the change and growth of an organization, and to reflect the vision and values of people in the present day. And those present day people are affected and operate by those policies and procedures. It makes sense to have them, their backgrounds, their perspectives reflected and represented in the policies and procedures manual. Again, through a recovery lens, policies and procedures strive to be responsive to issues that may occur or have already happened in an organization, and those policies and procedures make an effort to respond in a way that hold people accountable. Of course, in order to support the organization's health and the person's professional growth, at the same time, it preserves people's dignity and humanity. And finally, through recovery lens, transparent and inclusive language reflects respect for diversity in backgrounds and, again, in perspectives that engages people in really enacting and reinforcing policies and procedures that resonate with them. You've mentioned in the previous presentation that if legalese, for instance, is the preferred term for certain stakeholders, there's an opportunity also to include a clarification in the policies and procedures manual on what the language means so that it's readable and relatable to all team members. So in the next slide, we'll dive a little bit deeper around the language. And if you've ever attended one of the presentations that are kind of prevalent out there around person-centered planning, language tends to be key. So it's helpful for us to incorporate person-focused recovery-oriented, and strengths-based language. One example, I believe, is wording from a policy manual introduction from NIAPRS, right? So we have an example here for you today. And it says, our organization depends on our employees for our success. We strive for an environment in which all employees can reach their full potential, creating an efficient, effective organization that is a valued community resource. How does that sound? To me, it's very hopeful. It opens up possibilities, and I would want to work for a company like this. So a nod to NIAPRS for this kind of language incorporated in their policy manual, and I believe strongly incorporated in their team's work. And with that, in the next slide, we just featured a few examples. And these terms may make sense to consider around wording for policies and procedures, especially around service delivery or responses to crisis situations. On the left-hand side are the traditional language that perhaps we've come to know and familiarized with in the past, and some recovery language to replace them. So rather than saying disturbed, perhaps replacing the wording to say confused, from difficult to challenging, from saying that someone is a liar, to saying someone believes that, ... someone argumentative could be someone who argues strongly for something that they believe in. And it's very strengths-based, non-judgmental, and non-pathologizing language. And finally, manipulative can be, in other terms, persuasive, and non-compliant, one of the classics, can be switched to chooses not to. So these are some examples of how we can switch the wording so that it means a little bit something different, and it can cause us to perhaps approach situations differently. So again, language is key. Another example that we wanted to feature for you is a weapons policy, again from NIAPRS. And we really loved the way that they worded it, so we featured it here today. NIAPRS recognizes the importance of a safe and secure environment for all persons on the organization's property. Accordingly, the possession and or use of weapons or other instruments that can be used as weapons are strictly prohibited on NIAPRS property, in personal vehicles while conducting business for NIAPRS or in any other location during working hours or while representing NIAPRS. This policy applies to all persons entering the NIAPRS property, employees, clients, vendors, and visitors alike. So this language, we believe, is focused on physical and emotional safety, and I think it lays it out fairly clearly in readable terms. But as always, as mentioned in the previous slides, I believe it was around the cultural lens, the wording may change over time, or the policy or procedures may change over time depending on the times. And it will always be updated based on how the organization is composed. So let's take it to the next slide. Okay, so in thinking about this, so just as it's important to review anything before finalization, it's helpful to review policies and procedures and perhaps pilot them or run them through a focus group to get feedback before these policies and procedures get firmly established. And in this process, you might be thinking about who your audience is, how the procedures might align with your organization's philosophy, what's feasible, and what needs revision based on feedback from audience members and stakeholders. So just a few things for us to consider. Let's take a look at the next slide around access to policy and procedures. So in this same review, it's also helpful to think about how stakeholders will access the policies and procedures and how the organization's values will be reflected and connected to the team's practice. For instance, some questions to consider around training and implementation around policies and procedures include, how are the stakeholders going to be trained? Is there an attestation form associated with the training? Is there an intranet that will be regularly updated, or a SharePoint site when policies and procedures shift, which they will inevitably do as the organization grows and changes itself? And also, how are stakeholders notified of the changes so that everyone's in the loop? All about transparency, all about respect for people's ability to take part in this process. So in the next slide, we also wanted to give consideration for using a template. A standard template can be helpful so that policies and procedures are consistent throughout in formatting. And we listed a few sources here from boardsource.org. The website offers some sample policies and procedures for board of directors, and Council of Nonprofits.org provides additional resources on topics to inform the development of policy and procedures. And one particular detail around this is an interesting tidbit around internships in the era of COVID. So one last consideration in thinking about connecting a recovery lens with policies and procedures is in the next slide. Consistency across programs. So while we consider the unique strengths and needs of each program in an organization, it's equally important to be consistent across programs with regard to how each might contribute to the organizational culture and decisions around how data will be collected and how each program will be evaluated. So now to just exemplify a recovery lens from concept to practice and really bring the recovery lens to life, I'm going to hand it over to Eve and Kristen, who will be discussing the policies and procedures from Recovery Options Made Easy.
And do justice to your presentation. Kirsten, I'd like to introduce you to our audience, and I'd like to introduce our audience to you. Kirsten Vincent is the CEO of Recovery Options Made Easy in Western New York. She has over 20 years of experience in the behavioral health field and has been at Rome for 14 years. Is that right, Kirsten?
No, I've been with Rome for 6.5 years.
Oh, okay. Boy, I exaggerated that one. Well, 6.5 years is good too. And I understand that, you've slowly moved up in the organization to your current role. So so you can speak about policies and procedures in a variety of ways. So I'm just going to kind of start our conversation, and I want to remind people that they can go into the chat box and ask us questions as well. So as the CEO of the organization, how much of a hand do you have in the policy and procedure development process?
I definitely still have a hand in this role. I will say that it was a larger role when I was writing programs and doing direct program managing. But as CEO, I still am involved in the creation and development of all policies. Procedures, I will let my program managers and my line staff and my managers take a much more solid role in creating the procedures, because they're the people who are in the field every day. They're the people who are directly working with our participants. So I really need their input and their expertise as we create those procedures. And then, once they give me an outline and, feeling as to how they would like those procedures to go, then we sit down together and we finalize them. So it is very much a collaborative team effort.
Yeah, and it sounds also that it's really a bottom-up approach as opposed to a top-down approach. which is important in sort of in the whole concept and ideas and the fundamentals of recovery. It's to give the people who are out there a voice and a choice. In other words, you can get something, you know, if a policy and procedure is there to get something done, there's a lot of ways, you know, I'm going to sort of translate a little bit of what you're saying, is that there's a lot of ways to do it, right? But let it come from those people who are there and who are doing it. And because at the end, the feasibility is much more likely to be effective if you have the people who are actually in the field coming up with that. So let me ask you this. When you think about, and you're a very recovery-oriented organization, so what is the approach that you have? So in other words, you let your staff and the participants kind of participate and collaborate. So what kind of filters do you ask them to use as they develop their policies and procedures for presentation to you? Do you give them specific instructions?
No, when we sit down to talk about that, you know, the outline or the guidelines for a policy and procedure, I really want it to be a very organic conversation. I want people to feel comfortable saying to me and to our team how they're feeling, what they really see the impact of a policy being, or the procedures associated with that policy. And I figure once we get all of that organic input, then we can start really looking at how we have to frame it so that it's a policy that can be consistent. We're an agency that serves 20 counties in the Western New York and the Finger Lakes region. So I have programs that are the same program in multiple areas, but they're hundreds and hundreds of miles apart. So, you know, I have to take into account that I have housing programs in urban areas and in rural areas. I have housing programs in the northern part of the Western New York and Finger Lakes region, as well as in the southern part of those regions. So you need to have consistency for policies, but you need to have input from all of the regions so that you can make a policy and create the procedure that's effective, but that is positive for every one of those regions. So that's why I want everybody to just bring me their thoughts, and then we will write those out together and structure that policy for the program and for the participants and for the staff.
Did you ever have a situation where you came up with a policy and procedure and it was part of a compliance? So in other words, you needed this policy in terms of your contractual obligations to your funder, to the state. Did you ever come across a situation where you submitted a policy and procedure for review and got feedback that it was not it was not what they wanted, or that it was not specific enough or anything like that?
Yes, I've gotten feedback that, you know, policies that we created maybe didn't really take in enough of the actual needs of the program, so that we needed to maybe fill in some gaps that we had left out. I've gotten feedback that it addressed the issue on one level, but didn't fully address it. So we needed to take a look at that. You know, writing things in a recovery-oriented lens using strength-based language is key to who we are and what we do. But you know, I have gotten feedback from government entities, you know, that the language was too soft. It didn't convey a strict enough message. I generally will push back on that. I think as long as it says what it needs to say, I'm going to be as positive as I can be. I don't think that you need to be harsh to convey a message. But I also think that sometimes you get into something and you start working on something and it becomes very close to you and you get a little tunnel vision with it. So you have to take that feedback and you have to really look at it. and then say, is this accurate? Am I, is what I've written right and good for my staff and good for my participants and good for my community? Or did I actually miss something? And that's when we'll take it back to the whole team and say, this is the feedback we got. Can we take a look at it? Let's re-examine it a bit.
Yeah, one of the things that I was alluding to is that, government can sometimes be authoritarian. And when you're looking at trying to do things through a recovery lens, it's much more participatory and collaborative. And so, so those kinds of conflicts could come up. And as I think you're right, I think as long as you convey, what needs to get done and the steps in which to do it, it doesn't have to be in a coercive, authoritarian way. It can be done in a way that engages people so that they're much more, the argument is always people are much more likely to follow a policy and procedure if they're engaged in the process. And if the language is engaging language, as opposed to language that is, you must kind of language, as opposed to inviting people to do something. Yeah.
And
So,
it needs to be respectful, because if it's respectful and if it shows that you've taken the participant and the staff, into, consideration when you're writing them, then definitely people are going to want to follow it.
do you find in your experience that in terms of the recovery lens that it's easier to develop personnel policies and procedures versus programmatic policies and procedures, because they are slightly different? So how do you see that? How do you see that distinction in terms of getting that, getting policies and procedures written in a way that is consistent with your philosophy? And do you find that there's a difference when you're approaching personnel? And actually, two-part question. That's the first part. And the second part is, why is it important to use recovery-based language and to develop policies through a recovery-based lens when you're doing personnel policies and procedures?
So I would say that yes, there is a difference in the type when you're developing policies. There are policies that are for staff, and sometimes they're based on things that the agency needs. Sometimes they're based on contractual issues between us and whoever it is that we may be contracting with, and sometimes they are state mandated, federally mandated things that we just have to implement. Corporate compliance issues, HIPAA issues, things along those lines. When there are things that are regulatory, we will write the language as best we can to make sure that it fits in with our strength-based language philosophy, but we don't have too much leeway. When it comes to policies and procedures that are for our staff versus policies and procedures that are for our programs or for our participants, it is easier to write policies and procedures for my staff. While I have a staff of about 105, but we know each other, so it's a little bit easier when we sit down as a team to discuss those things, because we're working for our agency as a group, our work family. So we're very immersed in our culture. We're very used to each other and how we speak. So those are definitely, for me, I feel that they're easier to write. When it comes to program policies or policies that are specifically for my participants, I have, oh my gosh, we have a lot of participants across our 20 counties. And again, that's a lot of people that we want to make sure we are being respectful for, that we are, considering in every step of what we're doing. But it's harder because it's just a lot more people. We don't talk every day. We don't have that same level of relationship just because we're not in that kind of constant communication. So it is more challenging, and you're taking a lot of people and a lot of different needs into account when you're writing up a program procedure. So that requires us to really think even more carefully about how we're going to word something.
Yeah, in some ways, because you are so steeped in the recovery culture, it may be easier because everybody, as you said, speaks the same language. So, sort of taking a different look at this, how do you ensure that or monitor that policies and procedures are being followed through a recovery-based lens? I mean, there's one thing about writing it down that way. How do you monitor that it's being followed that way?
We do a couple of different things, through team meetings, supervision. We talk about, how policies and procedures are going. Are there pitfalls that we didn't anticipate when we wrote something? Things sound great in theory. A lot of times they do not always work out as well in practice. So, those are things that we will discuss. I have a very open door policy with the staff. If something is not working, please come and let me know about it. And then I rely very strongly on the staff and our managers and our directors, just to really make sure that they're giving the staff the support that they need to follow the various policies and procedures that we have. We also do calls and surveys with our participants. We would like to get their input as often as possible. How are things going? And not just how are you doing with your peer provider, how are you doing just in general? Is the program that you're involved in working out for you? If we're looking for specific information about a policy that we've written or something that we've newly instated, we'll ask specifically about that. But getting feedback from all the levels of the agency and our participants is really how we ensure that things are going the way that we need them to.
Now, Kirsten, in all fairness, you're a peer-run organization. Do you think that that gives you sort of a slight advantage in kind of the topic that we're discussing in terms of developing policies and procedures through a recovery lens? And what would you say to providers who aren't peer-run? What would you tell them about, like, what, if you're not peer-run, you still do X, Y, and Z?
Do I think it gives us an advantage? I would guess that a lot of people would say it does. To me, it's still just the work that we do, and it's just making sure that our language is respectful and thoughtful and really takes into account the people around us that we're serving. To other providers or other agencies that are not peer-run agencies, we do a lot of consulting work, and we provide staff for several non-peer organizations who are providing peer services, and that's something that we train on. We'll have those kind of training sessions with administrators and managers and staff about strength-based language and effective communication, and we will talk about how if you're going to have a peer staff and a peer component to the work that you're doing, that really has to follow our language and our culture. So we'll help create those policies and procedures for other agencies, and then we provide supervision for the staff that we have at those other entities, and through supervision and conversations with them, and then ongoing training with the staff, will help them continue to maintain those standards in the things that we help them create.
So I'm going to ask you something that just occurred to me now, but you said you do consulting work, and I hope our audience hears that. Let me ask you this. So give me your elevator speech. You meet an organization, they call you up and they say, we'd like to, what do you do? Or how would you do that? So, like, the brief sort of how would you present yourself in terms of this whole thing? If I called you and said, look, we're not peer run, we want our policies and procedures to be recovery oriented. We don't know where to begin. Could you tell us a little bit about about yourself and about how you can help us do this? In like 5 or 6 sentences. Am I putting you on the spot too much here?
I was going to say 5 or 6 sentences. I don't know. I would give them.
All right, you could take 10 sentences. It's okay.
Well, I would just say, I would always give a very short synopsis of who we are as an agency, but, really what I would say to people is that it doesn't really matter if you're a nonprofit or for-profit. It doesn't matter if you're in the health and human services field or, in any other field, that how you speak to your employees and how you treat your participants, your consumers, customers, depending on the industry that you're in, really all people want is to be treated with dignity and respect. And if you want to be effective in your leadership with your staff, and if you want to be effective in your service to your customers, then you really want to utilize that strength-based language in every aspect of your company. Policies, procedures, marketing, anything where you're touching other people, you want to have that component.
All right, so I come back with a question and say, well, Kirsten, I get it when you're talking about our consumers. I get that, our participants, the people we serve. But what does it have to do with our staff? I mean, like, why should we be concerned about those things with our staff? How does it help our staff?
Well, your staff is how you run your business, and without creating a positive environment for your staff to thrive in, you're really hampering the ability of your business to thrive. People, just like your customers, your staff want to be treated with that same level of respect and dignity. So when you create positive strength-based language in your policies and procedures for your staff, you're letting them know that you care about them. You're letting them know that they're important to you and that you're going to treat them with respect, and you're going to create that environment that's going to allow them to thrive.
Right, and also to sort of engage with the policies that that they understand, not only that they understand the policies, but also that they have bought into the policies, which then they're much more likely to follow in the way that you expect. So and I like the way you said that. It doesn't matter if you're a for-profit or a nonprofit, if you're in human services or not, that sort of these are principles in a way that really cut across the board of employee-employer relationships and services, customers. We talk about the experience of care. We talk about employee satisfaction. And, I think that while we're talking about policies and procedures, they are in effect, the policies and procedures are in effect the manual, right? They're what do you call it? The operations manual of an organization. And so, I think about, sometimes you buy a product and it comes with a manual and you read the instructions and you can't understand what it wants you to do. And so, understanding, I'm curious, do you provide a rationale at the beginning of each of your policies where you state what your objective is?
We provide a bit of an overview as to why the policy is being created, but we do that more in depth when we introduce a policy to the staff. So if we have created a policy and the procedure that goes with it, we send that out to all of the staff electronically. We also ask our managers in every office to print it and put it out so that people can review it. And that's where we give more of that detailed rationale as to why did we have to create this? Excuse me. And where does it fit in our agency? Who is it impacting? And how are we going to proceed with implementing it? And then all of our policies and procedures are posted on, we have a share drive that everybody has access to. So those are posted there so that people can always have access to it. And in every office, there's also a hard copy of our policy and procedure manuals, and then new ones get added to that.
How do you handle this? How do you handle this with new hires and orientation?
So when we go through our orientation with our new staff, they're given a copy of the policy and procedure manual electronically, and they are asked to read it and sign off on it. But we go through it with them as well to see if they have any questions. But then that's also posted in their, when you log into your time cards with us, there's a link that also takes it to you there. So anybody can access it wherever they need it.
So you really are aware that, the policies and procedure is something that should be very accessible to folks. And in fact, every time they're signing in to get paid, there's that reminder right there, right? If they
Yeah,
want
there's a series of links of different things that we want people to always have access to. So you can either access it through the company-wide drive if you're at work, or you can access it through our time card system.
Now, whenever if for some reason you have to change a policy and procedure midway because of a new regulation or something like that, but it's not that you have to kind of completely redo it. It's just that there's a sort of a variable in there that you would need to change. How do you let people know that this is happening?
Well, same kind of concept as if it were a new policy. We'll change the number. So if it was like policy 4.01, we would make that 4.01B. We would send that out again in the email with the explanation as to why we had to make the changes. We will highlight the changes in the policy so people can see where that new language was or why we had to change something. That also then would get printed and placed in every office and also put on the share drive.
Okay, and then do you tie in understanding policies and procedures in any way to your performance evaluations? Where is there sort of a connect that when you're actually talking to somebody about their performance for a period of time, whether you do it annually or semi-annually, where that becomes an area where that you evaluate how the person is following those things?
Well, definitely if there's an area somebody is having challenges with, that would become part of their performance review. We do them twice a year, and that conversation becomes, we've noticed that, this, particular policy, you're having some struggles with it. Let's talk about it. Everything starts with a coaching conversation. Everything starts with that strength-based. We're noticing this. How can we support you? How can we support you? Do you need some retraining on something? Do you need some additional one-on-one mentoring time? What is it that we can do to help you with this? And then that will become a goal for someone for their next review. But we do check-ins monthly with people to make sure that if they're having continued struggles, that we're continuing to add training or add mentoring time if we need to.
So it's full circle, right? What we're talking about here is, from the perspective of issuing a policy and procedure, new people coming in. So you've really covered the entire, and then sort of the monitoring and evaluation of individuals. So it sounds wonderful. I could see why you would be very helpful in helping other organizations adopt this sort of very comprehensive approach to policies and procedures. At this point, I would like to open it up to our audience. Do you have any questions for Kirsten?
Okay, great. Before we do that, Eve, do you want to, actually, Caitlin, if you want to pull the PowerPoint back up, there's a quick sort of review slide. And then while you're doing the review slide, Eve, I'll start going through the questions if you don't mind. Because we
Okay.
did have a few questions come in already, so I'll put those together. And then while we're doing that, if you all have some more questions, please type it in the chat box to all panelists. And we'll spend the next about 10 minutes going through some Q&A.
All right. So the key points, and please, Kirsten, feel free to add to this, because this certainly is not an exhaustive list. But if you feel that there are things here that we didn't include, please chime in. So the key points, the takeaways are that policies and procedures are connected to the organization's culture and philosophy, which means really that the more consistent you are in every other way of service delivery with your culture and philosophy, the easier it will be for your policies and procedures to also follow in that way. It is possible to thread the principles of recovery throughout policies and procedures, and I think Kristen really illustrated that in terms of language and approach and tone. Tone is something that we very often forget to be sort of very particular about, because a tone, an authoritarian tone, is likely to kind of push people away, whereas an invitational tone is one that will pull people in. And then the results will be evident, and if people are engaged and pulled in, they're much more likely, because they understand. And as Kirsten said, they are treated with dignity and respect in terms of how something is presented. You're much more likely to get the impact and the effect that you want from your policies and procedures. There is language that's important in terms of establishing that tone. And then review, making sure that you keep your policies and procedures current, relevant. And we're going to be spending an entire presentation in the fourth part of this series about that very topic. Again, as Kristen gave us an example, she has programs in a very large geographic area and very different kinds of of settings. And so it's important to be sensitive to the stakeholder needs if they're working in different kinds of settings. One set of steps in a procedure will apply to one setting, but not to another. And so it's important to take into consideration stakeholder needs based on stakeholder circumstances. Consider using a template, because that will at least be presentation that's consistent and easy to understand, and that every written policy and procedure follows certain steps. And again, consistency is important in terms of doing data collection, program evaluation. What we're doing here is trying to figure out how to align all the aspects of organizational life, from employee management to service delivery, and that there's really this consistent, cohesive sort of filter through which everything we do and everything we say and the way we behave, that it comes through in every way, in every aspect of the organization. And here we're talking about this idea about dignity, respect, choice, collaboration, cooperation, and all the things that define recovery and the principles of recovery. Did I do that well, Kirsten? Did I do that okay?
You did fantastic.
Okay.
And I would say we didn't really get to touch on it, but building a team around you that really believes in what, for me, building a team around me that really believes in what I believe in, that believes that, having that strength-based communication is just how we want to be all the time is really important. I have fantastic directors and fantastic managers and fantastic staff that, we want to be there for each other. We want to be there for our participants, and, finding people who are really knowledgeable. I have a brilliant HR director who understands the laws, and then we translate what we need to into that respectful language. You know, I've got great directors both for our programs that need licensure and our programs that are unlicensed that really work well together to make sure that we're translating language for all types of programs into the most strength-based that it can be. So you need a good team.
That's so true. Thank you. Okay,
All right,
Daniela,
so
let's hear the questions.
we've got some questions, yes. So first question is around, we're just going to go straight into teams since you all were just talking about teams. So what do you suggest to do if team members are reticent to share their feelings or contribute their input to policy creation? How do you help engage your staff in the process?
If you can tell that people are reluctant to share, maybe they're concerned that what they have to say isn't going to be well received, or if you have people that are just very quiet when you're talking about these kind of things, we will give them other venues to talk about feelings. You know, suggestion boxes that are anonymous. You know, we've looked at a couple of different software programs. We've used Poll Everywhere for a few things so that people can give input without having to put their name on it. You know, and that usually occurs either with people who are newer and are just concerned about being able to speak freely. So what we hope is that as we continue to, you know, bring people into the culture and help them feel, you know, comfortable and really help them understand that they can say, you know, what they need to say, you know, that their feelings are important. You know, there are no bad ideas. Like my favorite saying for the last several years has been like, look, somebody once in a staff meeting said, hey, let's make a movie about a tornado with sharks in it. And that was like a multi-billion-dollar industry. There is no idea that is bad. Say it, and you know, we'll talk through it. And once people are comfortable with that, they are much more likely to share. But giving them different venues to share until they're comfortable with that is a great way to go.
Yeah, I'm going to add something to that, and that has to do with expectations, and you know, that we have expectations of staff, but we very often don't have a sense of whether the person has the skill set to meet those expectations. And so I think that we have, as leaders, I think that we have to keep our eye on that and make sure that people have the skills to do what we're asking them to do, because otherwise we're asking people to do things and making life very difficult for them. So, you know, what training, what skills development do we need to engage in order to make sure that people can follow the policy and procedure? So keep that in mind, because that might be the reason that people don't speak up, because to speak up and to say I don't have the skills is sort of a dangerous thing to do for a lot of people. If I want to keep my job, how can I say that? So our being sensitive to that and making sure that people do have the skills in order to do what we expect and to follow the procedures and policies that we have out there.
And I also think it's important. Not every person is a perfect fit for every job. So I always want people to know, if you're in a position that you thought you really wanted and that you were excited about, but it's just not, for whatever the reason, not working for you. And you know, we've done different coaching things and different supportive things, and you would like to move to a different position, then let's do that. So I don't want people to ever think that, you know, bringing forward concern puts their job, puts their position with the agency at risk. It may mean we just need to find a position that they like better, if that's what they want.
So I want to get to another question, probably our last question before we run out of time, but certainly one that I wanted to address. And just to let our audience members know that we are keeping track of all of the questions throughout all of the series. And if we don't have time to answer them, we certainly will make sure that they're addressed in the tip sheets that we're creating. And we'll be releasing a tip sheet at the end of the webinar series as well. So be on the lookout for that. But this question is around aligning policies and procedures with anti-racism and anti-oppressive work. So the person who wrote the question wants to know if we could speak on how these policies, how policies through a recovery lens can align with anti-racism and anti-oppressive work, and what experiences or examples could you share, if any? And this is open for, obviously all of us. I know any of us could sort of dive into this, but it is an important one. So I thought we would try to address it before we finished up today.
Well, I have been talking for a long time. If somebody else wants to dive in first, but I am more than happy to answer.
Go ahead.
I would say that when you approach things with a team approach and you are maintaining that positive strength-based language, then you can create an environment where if people feel that a policy is racist or is culturally insensitive, then we want to bring those concerns to the table so that we can look at where. And in your key points that you brought out, you had review, review, review. That is incredibly important, because you could create a policy that 10 years ago worked and maybe has language in it that you didn't think was a concern, but a lot of things happen over time. So you want to always be reviewing your policies to try and pick up on those things. Have other people look at them too. Like I said, we get tunnel focused on something and we may miss it. So again, if you're doing things in that team approach, you are more likely to have a diverse group looking at what you're working on, and that will really help you make sure that you are being culturally sensitive.
So as Lawrence O'Donnell would say, I think Kirsten has the last word.
I think she does. And with that, I am going to say we are over time. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to remind you all that in 2 weeks, we'll have the last fourth session and the last session in our series, and that's called Keeping Policies and Procedures Current and Relevant and Responsive. And that'll be on the 8th, again, at 1 p.m. from 1 to 2. So please feel free to register for that event at ctacny.org. I want to say thank you to Eve and Marlo and John, and especially thank you to Kirsten for joining us today. And hopefully we will see you all in the next couple of weeks. Thanks so much and have a great day, everyone.
Just one thing, Kirsten, if people want to reach you for any reason, how can they do that? Can they go on the website
Yeah, they can go on our website, recoveryoptionsny.org. Daniela has my contact information. If anybody wants to email me directly, they could ask for that.
Yep.
But yeah, they can email me or they can call. Always happy to talk.
And anybody that's watching can also send any questions or comments through the mctac.info@nyu.edu email address, and then that'll come to me as well, and then we'll filter it back to Kirsten. Okay.
Great.
All right, folks. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everyone.